I was still sipping my lukewarm coffee when it happened. Right there on the Tuesday evening Zoom call for the Evergreen Meadows HOA board meeting, sandwiched between the usual complaints about dandelion invasions and some saccharine community spirit slide deck. The new president, Susan Whitaker, everyone just called her Karen behind her back, unmuted herself, leaned forward like she was starring in her own neighborhood cologne commercial, and announced with that fake polite smile, "We're optimizing our community management by streamlining enforcement with a professional firm. Mark, your volunteer role as compliance architect is no longer needed. Portal access will be revoked immediately." Then she smiled again. Not the grateful kind. The kind you give right before tossing someone overboard and pretending it was for the greater good of curb appeal. I didn't even have time to laugh before my admin dashboard glitched. Access revoked. The violation database froze mid-refresh. The automated dues collection app spat out, "User not found." That was my goodbye. No thank you plaque for the 8 years I'd spent coding the entire system from scratch, because Karen types like her kept weaponizing every blade of grass taller than 2 inches. Just cold, clean exile over speakerphone while the rest of the board sat mute, blinking like they'd seen a car crash in 4K. If you've made it this far into the story, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people watch these HOA Karen dramas without subscribing, and it really helps keep the spite-fueled storytelling alive. Now, back to the bloodbath. The silence afterward was its own kind of violence. No one knew where to look. I saw old Mrs. Jenkins from Lot 47 click her mic on and off like she wanted to say something, but remembered she still owed $3 in late fines for her unsightly American flag. The treasurer, my old golf buddy Dave, just stared blankly like someone had unplugged his spine. Thing is, they weren't wrong. I was just the volunteer IT guy who'd built the portal because the last thing anyone wanted was Karen personally knocking on doors at 7 a.m. with a tape measure. They thought enforcement happened by magic. What they didn't know, and what Karen definitely hadn't bothered to check before tossing the grenade, was that I never signed the final system rights away. When the board first hired me to build the custom HOA portal 8 years ago, legal had pushed for full ownership transfer. I added one quiet line to the architecture license buried in Appendix C. The core compliance and enforcement protocol remains licensed exclusively to the original architect unless explicitly revoked by unanimous board amendment with notarized signatures. It was camouflaged, legally invisible until it became handcuffs. They hadn't revoked it. They hadn't even read past the first page. So while Karen kicked back in her perfectly staged home office, thinking she'd shaved thousands off the annual budget and could now leverage professional management, what she'd really done was amputate every digital limb the neighborhood had without knowing where the arteries ran. I didn't say a word. I just shut my laptop, picked up my digital badge, and left it face down on my desk like a tombstone. Nobody stopped me. Nobody looked up. That's when I knew they'd already lost. I didn't slam the door. I didn't text Dave back when he wrote WTF with 17 question marks and a crying emoji. I just walked out. Not because I was defeated, but because the moment someone believes they can replace you in a week, you're already out of their league. By the time I hit the driveway, my pulse was steady. Not from shock, from clarity. You only panic when you've got something left to prove. I had nothing left to prove. At home, I brewed a proper cup of black tea, grabbed the decoy laptop from the false panel under my workbench, and booted it up in the dark. No Wi-Fi. No Bluetooth. Air-gapped. Independent power. My own little ark in the suburban flood. Most people assume the quiet guy who built the HOA app is just there to reset passwords and argue about why the violation photo upload keeps failing. What they don't understand is compliance architecture, the scaffolding behind the scaffolding. I designed the entire backend like a vault with a whisper. The violation chains, the automated fine triggers, the legal audit logs, the bank syncs, they all lived in pieces. Only one place held the master reconstruction protocol. That place was here. This laptop. And the ownership of those core components? Well, I'd never worked under a simple volunteer agreement. I'd operated through my small LLC for consulting purposes per the board's original workaround to avoid insurance headaches. So when they signed the platform charter, I slipped that same sentence into the appendix. Nothing flashy. No bolding. Just a quiet clause under the layer ownership section. They co-signed it. Never amended it. Never even noticed. They'd stripped my access and slammed the door shut without realizing they'd locked themselves out of their own neighborhood. The locks were still mine. The keys registered under my LLC's compliance ID. The tokens stored in a licensed vault with quarterly ping checks. And the moment those pings failed, the chain started decaying. That night, I initiated a soft alert. Not a kill switch, just a gentle timeout. The system wouldn't crash. It would simply forget them. Violation reports would time out. Due syncs would return invalid issuer. Automated notices would bounce with certificate mismatch. Nothing loud, just erosion. I sat back in the dark, watching the console's heartbeat. One line at a time, the old world slipped into silence. Karen had pulled the trigger thinking it was cost-cutting. Turns out it was a starter pistol, and I was already halfway to the finish line. By the time the rest of the neighborhood was dragging their weekend hangovers into Wednesday morning coffee, I was on a secure VPN with my new consulting gig already humming against the side of a fresh monitor. A clean desk, dual screens, coffee that didn't taste like HOA despair. The firm was called Horizon Compliance Partners, lean, lethal, and ironically the same company some HOAs hired when their Karens imploded. They didn't hire me for what I'd built. They hired me because they'd watched it not fail. Subtle difference, but it mattered. They didn't ask for a resume. They'd seen the compliance logs. One of their execs had once been on the receiving end of a frantic call during a previous HOA meltdown. He remembered my architecture. He remembered it never timed out. Now I was systems compliance architect again, but this time with real pay and absolute design autonomy. They didn't want me on endless Zoom calls. They wanted systems that didn't break when Karen's did. I didn't post on Nextdoor. Didn't change my profile. Didn't even open the app. Let Evergreen Meadows think I was licking my wounds in the backyard, burning sage and crying into the void. Meanwhile, I was sketching out encryption redundancies for other gated communities I wasn't even allowed to name out loud. At 9:16 a.m., the first ripple hit. The new professional management firm Karen had hired, a group of underpaid, overpromised admins halfway across the state, tried deploying their freshly minted security tokens into the violation gateway. Probably thought it'd be plug and play. Fire up the new credentials, change a couple DNS pointers, and carry on with their Wednesday. The system spit out a single response. Unrecognized administrator. Contact original system owner. No red flags. No breakdowns. Just an unblinking wall that didn't even recognize they existed. I didn't get the alert, but I saw it coming. Because when I'd left, I didn't just walk away. I withdrew. Withdrew identity tokens. Revoked session propagators. Set the license monitors to recognize external access attempts and silently invalidate anything that didn't match a root signature tied to my LLC. They hadn't just failed to onboard new tokens. They'd announced their absence loudly to every upstream system still running on my architecture. From my quiet new desk, I sipped better coffee, looked out the window at my own perfectly legal dandelion-free lawn, and let the realization settle in. You can't outsource trust. Not in a week. Not ever. It started with whispers, unconfirmed screenshots, secondhand pings. One of the project managers in the old board frantically texting a mutual neighbor. Can he still access the route? Like I left the back door in the fence, and they were hoping maybe, just maybe, I'd forgotten to lock it. By Thursday, the whispers turned to fire alarms. Violation workflows jammed like rusted gates. The automated fine generator timed out. Dues uploads returned error chains too long for the screen to display. That alone triggered an overnight halt in monthly collections. One of our key community contracts, the landscaping maintenance agreement that kept the common areas from looking like a trailer park, got flagged for non-compliance after a routine audit ping failed. You don't realize how many things depend on one invisible scaffolding until that scaffolding vanishes. I didn't gloat. Didn't even follow the drama too closely. But people talk. People panic. People leak. A next-door screenshot from an internal board channel ended up forwarded to someone on my new team. They shared it during our morning stand-up. Not maliciously, just with a raised eyebrow and a chuckle. One user: "Why are violation reports bouncing?" Another: "Did anyone archive his private keys?" Followed by the kicker from Karen herself in all caps: "This is sabotage. Mark is clearly trying to undermine the new professional standards." The new management firm, still high off Karen's streamlining buzz, tried to downplay it. "He was just infrastructure," Karen wrote in one thread. "We'll generate new tokens like digital trust can be conjured out of thin air with a PDF and a pep talk." They tried. They generated new credentials, submitted new search chains, even looped in one of the contractors to mirror the root. But the root server rejected everything because the root server wasn't theirs to command anymore. It was a distributed node network running on trust blockside built by hand, signed with identity credentials that weren't stored on any of their systems. The infrastructure wasn't a blueprint. It was a living organism that didn't recognize them anymore. They didn't have access because they had never earned it. And in their scramble to replace me, they'd cut the one thread that held it all together: continuity, while they shouted over each other in the HOA Slack, reset tokens, and sent panicked emails with flagged importance. I sat in a glass-walled office overlooking a lake. I didn't have to commute to board meetings anymore. My terminal blinked softly in the corner. Silent. Clean. I didn't have to say anything. Sometimes your absence speaks louder than any line of code. Legal always arrives late, dragging the smell of scorched paper and desperation behind them. They don't show up when the lawns are perfect and the dues are flowing. They show up when signatures start matching more than community standards. When somebody finally asks, "Wait, who actually owns this?" It took 4 days of outages, 5 botched credential renewals, and a quietly suspended landscaping contract before the suits got involved. Not the loud ones who do boardroom backflips, but the quiet ones, the compliance lawyers, the covenant whisperers, the ones who look like they've slept in their chairs since 2009 and speak in red lines. They dug in hard. Every master agreement, every outdated API key, every SSO handshake that had passed through the audit gate. At some point, someone must have realized the compliance chains weren't just missing. They were actively rejecting substitution, not failing, refusing. That's when the panic sharpened into silence. The story came through a third-hand contact, a neighbor who still sat on the architectural review committee, one of the paralegals, fresh out of law school, and probably wondering how her life had become a scavenger hunt for digital ghosts. Found it buried in the 2016 Platform Charter. Appendix C, page 23, Subclause 14. Core Compliance and Enforcement Protocol remains proprietary to the original architect unless dissolved via formal unanimous board amendment. Not modified, not reissued, not nullified by the new management contract. Unanimous amendment. There wasn't one. Karen's name never appeared. Mine, clear as daylight, signed in ballpoint and scanned back with a timestamp. And that's when it hit them. Not like thunder, but like ice in the lungs. This wasn't a hack. This wasn't sabotage. This was structure. They hadn't been outmaneuvered. They'd simply failed to read, to ask, to understand that ownership in HOA tech isn't always where the headcount lives. It's where the fingerprints still unlock things. And mine did. My new firm didn't comment. They didn't need to. They knew what was happening. I'd told them about the clause during onboarding. They asked if it was likely to cause disruption. I said, only if they pretend it doesn't exist. They pretended. Now legal was waist-deep in old contracts, trying to reverse engineer a timeline they didn't author, desperately hoping someone had slipped a void clause in later. But the truth was simple. No one had ever undone what I'd written, and what I wrote had weight. It wasn't revenge. It was architecture. The irony of it all was that the annual compliance audit had been routine, just a checkbox, a formality with city oversight that we'd passed like clockwork for years. We'd built the violation reporting pipeline to be bulletproof, mirrored across redundant clouds, scrubbed for anomalies twice daily. But the real protection wasn't the tech. It was the trust. Trust anchored by a very specific chain of certificates. And those certs weren't just files. They were legal signatures bound by license, bound by identity. On that particular Thursday, the new firm logged into the violation portal with their shiny new credentials. Karen had prepped a batch of urgent notices, probably confident they could brute force past whatever legacy structure I'd left behind. The system blinked, processed, then spat out a single line, system unverified. Search chain incomplete. That's not an error message. That's a wall. See, the violation portal doesn't just check if the photo misses. Jenkins' flag is correctly timestamped. It verifies the entire chain of trust, root cert, intermediate, session layer, and finally the originating compliance signature. It needs continuity. It needs proof that the person issuing notices today is connected legally and technically to the framework previously approved by the city. They didn't have it, so the portal refused to proceed. No warnings, no workarounds, just a cold technical shrug. On the emergency board call, a city compliance officer, one I'd worked with dozens of times, paused the meeting. Not hostile, just procedural. "Who is your authorized compliance holder?" he asked. Tone clipped and exact. You could almost hear the room full of Karen's clench. After a beat, someone, maybe Karen herself, mumbled, "We outsourced that." There was a silence then. Not awkward, judicial. The officer scribbled something, then said flatly, "Then you're out of scope until we hear from the original cert signatory." No raised voices. No second chances, just that line. And with it, the entire regulatory framework of their violation enforcement paused. Frozen. Expire by proxy because the city didn't recognize them. Not without me. Somewhere in that call, someone probably realized this wasn't just about access. This was about authorization. And you can't bluff your way through a city-tracked ladder when the final link leads to someone you've publicly dismissed like they were just another volunteer you could swap out with cheaper labor. I didn't crash their system. I simply didn't speak for it anymore. And without that signature, nothing they said could be verified. It didn't unravel all at once. It never does. These collapses move slowly. Too slowly for Karen's high on optimism and outsourcing savings to notice until their inboxes fill with silence. Then red flags. Then polite threats wrapped in legal language. The first hit came from the landscaping vendor. They froze service after their token handshake expired during a routine validation sweep. Nothing dramatic, just a failure to verify authority. Next came the dues processor. An import manifest of monthly payments flagged as non-compliant due to unverifiable certificate lineage. That little phrase alone triggered a hard stop on every auto draft coming from residents' banks. But the big one, the one that sent quiet panic into the boardroom, was the city beautification grant. Multi-year, politically visible, reliant entirely on verified compliance reporting. When the audit trail broke, the city suspended the agreement pending formal review. And by review, they meant explain why the only person who could legally submit your data no longer works for you. I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. By the end of the week, 2 partner HOAs contacted me directly. Quiet emails, neutral tone, but the subtext was clear. We don't care about evergreen meadows. We care about what you built. One of them said it plainly. You designed the trust layer. Can you recover it? Not will you? Not do you want to? Can you? Because even they didn't know if the current mess was salvageable. I responded professionally. I told them I was under a new contract, operating independently, and that any re-engagement would need to go through proper licensing channels. My new firm handled the rest. Meanwhile, back at Evergreen Meadows, the board finally called Karen in. No announcement, no press release, just a quiet review behind frosted glass. I wasn't mentioned, but the questions all orbited me. Who authorized the vendor termination? Did anyone confirm licensing ownership? Why didn't we get that amendment in writing? My name didn't need to be said. It was baked into the source code of every system that now refused to respond. I hadn't sabotaged a thing. I hadn't touched a single line since I left. All I did was withdraw my signature. And without it, their world stopped listening. It came in the form of a signal, not a plea. A senior director from the old board reached out, not from her work email, but from a personal encrypted channel I'd set up years ago for executive continuity during security drills. That she still hadn't told me everything. She remembered who built the fallback systems. Her message was short, professional, measured like a bomb tech's heartbeat. We're willing to license your framework. We'll name your firm. You stay external. Not come back. Not help us fix this. Just, we know you still hold the skeleton key, and we can't afford to keep the lights off any longer. I waited 12 hours before applying. Not out of spite, just alignment. My new firm helped me draft the terms. Nothing outrageous, just precise. Externalized service license. No internal reintegration. I wouldn't be a volunteer. I'd be an asset. Monthly fee indexed to access volume. If they pushed more traffic through the framework, the price scale with it. And the kicker, enforce third-party audit trail. Every access, every change, every submission tied to immutable logs visible to both sides. No more shadow edits. No more magic credentials behind closed doors. They agreed quickly, silently. The contract came through within 48 hours. My LLC name now lived in the metadata of every critical handshake their systems performed. They didn't celebrate. There was no all hands, no cake, no welcome back email because I wasn't back. I hadn't returned. I had evolved into something they couldn't touch, couldn't fire, couldn't scapegoat. My framework ran beneath them like a buried power line. Critical, humming, invisible. They'd strip me out thinking I was just a technician. Now they paid a premium to borrow my shadow. No more Zoom calls. No daily check-ins. I was a ghost in their infrastructure, visible only when something broke or someone questioned the origin of trust. I'd become what they could never replace, the part they couldn't understand well enough to steal. It was supposed to be their clean slate, the redemption slide deck. The proof of life architecture that showed the HOA had finally re-centralized and regained control. Glossy graphics, buzzwords bloated to bursting, AI-enhanced security framework, and realigned compliance interface. All fluff around a single goal: convince the city auditors that everything was back under control. The final debrief had been delayed twice. Everyone knew why. You don't face city auditors unless you're ready to explain every signature, every cert, every timestamp, and in their case, explain why half the system had ghosted them for 3 weeks. They came armed with a printed compliance summary. 2 VPs and Karen, the president who started it all, sitting tight in a tailored blazer that couldn't hide the sweat pooling behind her collar. The auditor, mid-50s, government steady voice, flipped through the documents slowly, page by page, with the indifference of someone who's seen too many HOAs learn too little too late. Then he stopped. A slight shift in posture, a narrowing of the eyes. He tapped the paper. "This cert, it's not yours. Whose signature is this?" Silence. You could hear a pen click 6 chairs away. The lead compliance officer leaned forward, stammered something about third-party licensing, but the auditor had already read it right there at the bottom of the root metadata. "My name. My LLC." He didn't smile, didn't raise his voice. Just underlined the cert with a capped pen and closed the folder like it had delivered its own verdict. The meeting ended early. By sunrise the next morning, Karen was gone. No statement, no farewell email, just erased quietly and quickly like a patch rolled out at 3 a.m. to fix a security hole no one would admit was ever there. Back at my own firm, the only notification I received was an automated ping. Access token verified. Routine. Clean. Quiet. The certificate hadn't shouted. It hadn't threatened. It had simply spoken. One signature. One immutable truth baked into the bones of their system. They had outsourced the man, but not the key. And without the key, nothing opens. The neighborhood didn't throw a parade. They didn't need to. The dandelions stayed gone. The flag stayed legal. The fines started flowing again, only now with proper audit trails everyone could see. Residents whispered about the quiet guy on Maple Lane who somehow still held the neighborhood together from the outside. Karen's for sale sign went up 2 weeks later. Last I heard, she moved to a condo downtown where there are no HOAs to rule and no quiet architects to underestimate. Me, I kept the consulting gig, kept the Lakeview office. And every quarter, I watched the logs tick up with a quiet, satisfied sip of coffee. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. It's just letting the system you built remember exactly who built it. And when the Karens of the world finally realize the fine print they ignored is the only thing still standing between them and chaos, well, that's when a story gets really good. The final chapter didn't need fireworks. It needed truth. 3 months later, the new board, now properly advised, held an open neighborhood meeting in the community center. No Zoom this time. Real chairs, real faces, real consequences. I wasn't invited, but I didn't have to be. The city auditor was there again, this time as a guest speaker, flipping through the same folder that had ended Karen's reign. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. He simply projected the single page from Appendix C onto the big screen and asked one question. How many of you actually read the documents you sign? The room went dead quiet. Then the laughter started, nervous at first, then the kind that comes when everyone realizes they almost lost their dues money, their landscaping, their peace of mind to one woman's ego. Old Mrs. Jenkins stood up and said, loud enough for the back row, I always knew that Portal was too good to be run by amateurs. Dave the treasurer just shook his head and muttered, we owe that man a beer and a raise. Outside, the sun was still shining on evergreen meadows. Lawns still exactly 2 inches. Flags still flying on the correct days. But something had changed. The power wasn't in the president's sash anymore. It was in the code, in the clause, in the quiet understanding that the guy who built the system could also unbuild it without ever raising his voice. I sat on my porch that evening, watching kids ride bikes past the NO soliciting sign that now actually worked because the enforcement engine was back online, properly licensed, properly paid, properly audited. My phone buzzed once. A single notification from the portal, license renewal confirmed. Monthly fee transferred. Audit trail immutable. I smiled, took another sip of coffee that finally tasted like victory, and closed the app. Karen's old house sold to a young couple who, rumor had it, immediately planted a vegetable garden in the front yard just to test the waters. The system didn't issue a single violation notice, because now the system knew exactly who was in charge. And it wasn't the loudest voice in the room. It was the one who had written the rules in the first place. That's the thing about HOAs. Everyone thinks the power comes from the meetings, the votes, the sashes. But real power? It lives in the fine print nobody reads until the lights go out. And when the lights finally flicker back on, and the person who flipped the switch is the same quiet neighbor they tried to erase, well, that's when the Karen story stops being a horror and starts being a legend. The neighborhood slept soundly that night. No frantic texts. No emergency Zooms. Just the soft hum of a system that remembered exactly who built it and who could take it away again if anyone ever forgot. End of story.